Thank you, Pramod, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to all participants, whichever time zones you are in. I understand we have 2 hours for this session, and Pramod, I hope all speakers are in. I have cited 4, 5 of them. Let me know
Sir,
if there's
Rahul is
anybody.
yet to join, and I think
Okay,
some will be joining in few minutes. But maybe
fair
we
enough,
can
fair enough.
check.
Yeah.
Uh,
So I'll just give certain opening remarks before I hand over. We have a long line of illustrious speakers. So back to Southeast Asia. So if we consider Southeast Asia as the central sub-region of the Indo-Pacific, and it connects the Indian Ocean region to the Western Pacific. Therefore, there are a slew of aspects that come into play, and one of the first that comes into mind are the sea lines of communication, where maritime trade that transits the Southeast Asian region is tremendous. But the area is also home to a highly unstable region for a variety of reasons. There are a host of traditional and non-traditional threats that these nations have to contend with. And then, if this is the central sub-region, then of course the term ASEAN centrality gains prominence. There are differing views on the term. And of course, there is the ASEAN statement that often comes out, don't force us to take sides. So therefore, Southeast Asia has a delicate balance to handle when it engages the Indo-Pacific regionally and the world globally. And so therefore, this region has got growing economies, there's a young population, and if ASEAN itself is the fifth largest economy and tipped to be the fourth largest by 2030, there is a reason to look at the area in holistic terms. From ASEAN itself, linked to the Indo-Pacific, there are two documents that come to mind. One is the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and the ASEAN Maritime Outlook. Linkages between the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, which was spoken by Prime Minister Modi some time back, have been sort of established. The working methodologies are, some have worked out, some are still work in progress, and the ASEAN Maritime Outlook itself has got differing views and differing how analysts look at it in differing views. As far as India ASEAN is concerned, Prime Minister Modi at the 20th India ASEAN Summit in September 2023 spoke of a 12-point proposal for strengthening cooperation between India and ASEAN and covering aspects like connectivity, digital transformation, trade and economic engagement, contemporary challenges, addressing of these challenges, people-to-people contacts, and deepening strategic engagement. There are therefore similar convergences and interactions between other nations and ASEAN. And then, of course, intra-ASEAN dynamics are always areas of interest for nations who wish to engage ASEAN and look at the centrality of this region in the Indo-Pacific. These are some aspects, and we have an excellent panel of 8 speakers who would cover hopefully these and many other aspects, talking about the position that Southeast Asia occupies in the Indo-Pacific. Since we have around 2 hours, I will request all speakers to stick to 10 minutes, and I will prod each speaker off for a round off at 9 minutes. And that should leave us sufficient time for question and answers. And I will go the list as provided in the brochure. So, Captain Furuya, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon from Tokyo. No, actually, I'm not in Tokyo, but today I am from Keio University, Shonan Fujisawa campus. So it is 50 kilometers away from Tokyo. But anyway, I'm Captain Kentaro Furuya, and Adjunct Professor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, and Keio University, the Professor at the Japan Coast Guard Academy in Japan. It is an honor to address this important event on the topic of Southeast Asia in the Indo-Pacific. As someone from Japan, I hope to share an external perspective on the region, focusing on the South China Sea and the pivotal role it plays in shaping the border in the Pacific landscape. Southeast Asia and South China Sea are immensely important to Japan, both strategically and economically. Over 80% of Japan's energy imports pass through the maritime corridor in South China Sea, making its stability indispensable to our economy. Beyond trade, the region's security is central to maintaining Japan's energy security and diplomacy. A free and open Indo-Pacific, a vision Japan has championed, depends significantly on the stability of Southeast Asia. However, the increasing assertiveness of China in the South China Sea poses significant challenges. from extensive territorial claims under so-called 9-dash line to militarization and gray zone tactics. These developments undermine international law and threaten the principle of freedom navigation that Japan holds dear. Japan's approach to the South China Sea is rooted in adherence to international law, particularly the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea on UNCLOS. The 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling, which found China's 9-dash line inconsistent with UNCLOS, was a landmark decision. While Japan is not a claimant state in South China Sea, understanding of the destabilization effect such tactics can have on regional stability and the rule-based international order. Japan has committed partner to Southeast Asian nations, working to share fundamental values and strengthen their security capabilities. For instance, Japan has facilitated dialogues among Coast Guard agencies in the Indo-Pacific to promote a rule-based international order at sea. In 2004, Japan launched the Head of Asian Coast Guard Agencies meeting as a platform for cooperation and coordination. Building on this, the Coast Guard Global Summit was introduced in 2017 as an inter-regional forum to foster mutual confidence and promote the rule of law at sea. Beyond the dialogue, Japan has significantly contributed to enhancing the operational capabilities of regional coast guards, which have become increasingly vital players in the gray zone situations. At the tactical and operational level, comprehensive training programs are provided in areas such as search and rescue, oil spill response, high-speed boat operations, and martial arts for apprehension. To further enhance these efforts, the JCG Japan Coast Guard established the Mobile Cooperation Team, a highly specialized unit dedicated to tactical level capacity building programs. This team conducts on-site training, providing hands-on expertise in handling complex maritime scenarios in various situations. At the policy formulation level, the Japanese Coast Guard inaugurated the Maritime Safety and Security Policy Program in collaboration with the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Tokyo. This program serves as a cornerstone for fostering the rule-based international order in the Indo-Pacific. It equips promising Coast Guard officers from the region with advanced knowledge and expertise in maritime policy, security studies, international law, international relations, and Coast Guard operations, emphasizing the practical application of these disciplines to real-world challenges. By creating an environment that encourages cross-regional dialogue and the exchange of the best practices, the program strengthens mutual understanding and builds confidence among students. Graduates are not only trained to address immediate maritime concerns, but are also prepared to develop long-term strategies that reinforce stability and uphold the rule of law, ensuring the regional order is maintained amid evolving threats. In addition to those human resource development, Japan has collaborated with Southeast Asian nations to enhance their Coast Guard assets. These collaborations including providing the patrol vessels, upgrading maritime surveillance systems, and conducting joint training programs. These initiatives improve operational readiness, maritime domain awareness, and technical expertise, enabling the region to address maritime challenges collectively. Japan's historical and cultural ties to Asia as a foundation for fostering trust and collaboration with Southeast Asia. This unique position allows Japan to act as a non-Western partner that understands the regional context while promoting shared values. While maintaining the strong economic relations with China, Japan remains steadfast in supporting a rule-based international order and advancing ASEAN centrality. Our partnerships are grounded in mutual benefit and respect for regional ownership, ensuring that they contribute to sustainable development and long-standing regional peace and stability. Japan also recognizes the importance of collaboration with extra-regional powers. Regional challenges require collective solutions, and frameworks like Quad, which include the US, Australia, and India, play a critical role in enhancing regional stability. Joint naval exercises, coordinated development initiatives, and bilateral collaboration such as joint drills with the United States reinforce the principle of freedom navigation and rule-based international order. Furthermore, Japan welcomes the European Union's increasing engagement in the Pacific, including naval deployments and cooperation on maritime security and sustainability projects. This partnership reflects a shared commitment to upholding international norms and supporting Southeast Asia's stability. Japan also sees opportunities to collaborate with Canada and the United Kingdom, whose increased attention to Indo-Pacific security aligns with regional priorities. For instance, Canada's deployment of the naval asset to increase its presence in this region, and the UK's Carrier Strike Group operations signals their growing commitment. These partnerships demonstrate a shared commitment to stability while leveraging diverse capability to address challenges in areas such as maritime security, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief. By engaging a broad coalition of extra-regional stakeholders, Japan ensures a robust and inclusive approach to maintaining Indo-Pacific security. In conclusion, the South China Sea is not just a regional security issue. It is a global concern. Preserving stability in Southeast Asia is shared responsibility, and Japan believes in the importance of collective action to uphold the principle of freedom, transparency, and the rule of law. By working together, we can ensure that the Indo-Pacific remains a regional opportunity and stability for generations to come. As we move forward, Japan remains steadfast in its commitment to being a partner that supports Southeast Asia's aspirations for peace, prosperity, and sustainable development. Together, we can create further that reflect our shared values and visions for the Indo-Pacific. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Captain Furuya, for sticking to the time and so succinctly addressing many issues. I like the manner in which you linked South China Sea with the East China Sea. There are lessons for many nations to take away from the instability and the various challenges and threats arising from these two regions, and also the efforts put in and insights on Japan's efforts to cooperation regionally and also with many organizations, and of course the interaction between white hulls, which is not a very oft discussed element. And then, of course, the whole idea on stability. And Dr. Koga, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your invitation to this the panel. So the panel's topic is the Southeast Asia in the Pacific, and I think there are many things that can be said from this kind of broader topic. But then today I'd like to focus on the Southeast Asia's reaction to the Trump 2.0, because this is actually the really important issue in finding how the U.S. is going to formulate its Indo-Pacific strategy in the future. And also, even though we actually are not really sure Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy will be, there are actually some expectations that the Southeast Asian countries would anticipate from the next administration. So I'm gonna just kind of talk about the 3 points on this from the Southeast Asian perspective, how they are actually going to deal with the Trump 2.0. So there are many analyses on the Trump 2.0 in the Southeast Asia, but then the one thing that we could actually talk about is there's gonna be the less commitment from the United States to the multilateralism, in the Pacific. So as we could actually see in the past from the U.S. behavior to Southeast Asia, then the U.S. president, including the Biden, hasn't actually been really active in participating in the ASEAN led institutions. So the Trump actually went to the East Asia Summit, but he didn't really participate in the 2017. And since then, like he was not really the participating in the ASEAN-led institution, forums. And also the Biden didn't really participate in the later his kind of the terms. So I guess the United States was actually going to is going to be less committed to the multilateralism, and then this is a kind of like expectations that the Southeast Asian countries have right now. And then some the analysts or some the opinion leaders, such as the Tomiko, the former U.S. The Singaporean ambassador to the United Nations. He actually said like we must or we should actually lower the expectation to the ASEAN. So that's a kind of one the important point that the Southeast Asian countries expect for the U.S. Strategy in the Southeast Asia or beyond in the Indo-Pacific. And second thing is the United States will become more mercantilistic in terms of the economic policy, and then which would actually change the regional strategic dynamics. And specifically, we could actually talk a lot about it, but then probably we will see the end of the IPEF, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which was created by Biden. But then I don't think the Trump is really enthusiastic about the this framework. And then he actually also mentioned about the increasing the tariff on China by 60% and the others from the 10 to the 20%. That were probably like the bargaining tips that the Trump is going to use to negotiate with the each of the Indo-Pacific countries. But then this is going to be the some kind of the reference point that we can actually use in order to understand the U.S. economic policy in the Indo-Pacific. And also there is going to be a deeper decoupling from China on the basis of the technology field. And then another thing is the Trump is not really interested in the assistance for facilitating the green economy. So these are the things that we probably could see in the future. And then Southeast Asia is going to actually see if the U.S. demands, economic demands to the those countries can be manageable. But then at the same time, I think most of them are trying to actually diversify the risks of the U.S. The commitment or the U.S. economic policy towards Indo-Pacific, and then try to diversify its risk by engaging with the non-Western or like non-U.S. states, such as the China and also the BRICS. So this is one second thing. And then third thing is the Southeast Asian states will face kind of diverging the level of economic pressures from the United States. I think the most important kind of standard that or like the reference point we can use for the economic pressure coming from the United States is the trade balance. And if we see the bilateral trade balance between the United States and the Southeast Asian countries, I think the Vietnam and Thailand are the two the country that have the huge kind of trade surplus with the United States. And then on the other hand, there are the two countries which are actually having the trade deficit with the United States, that are the Singapore and Brunei. So I guess there's a kind of divergence in the economic pressure coming from the United States on the Southeast Asian countries. So what can we actually say from these kind of three points that I just raised in terms of the Southeast Asian kind of reaction or like the strategic dynamics of the Southeast Asian countries vis-a-vis the great powers in the Indo-Pacific? I guess there are several risks, like the three kind of risks that I can actually identify. One is probably like there would be some kind of like further division on the Southeast Asia, because of the deferring the U.S. economic pressure on the Southeast Asian countries. The Southeast Asian countries, each Southeast Asian country actually may have the different strategy to align with or like getting close to the other great powers. So, for example, probably Indonesia, Malaysia were looking for the institution or frameworks to hedge against the risk of the U.S. commitment. And then on the other hand, the Singapore, Brunei, or like Singapore particularly, are pretty comfortable with the U.S. economic policy because it might not be able to. I mean, it might not be going to get the strong pressure from the United States. So in that sense, there are diverging kind of like the strategic alignment which would go on in the Southeast Asia, and then that could actually divide the Southeast Asian strategic position. And then the second thing is probably like this leads to the ASEAN's kind of paralysis. Southeast Asia may lose its face to the ASEAN in dealing with the external relations, and then which I'm not saying that the ASEAN is going to actually dissolve or like collapse or dysfunction. I think the ASEAN is still useful in terms of the facilitating the intra-ASEAN cooperation. But again, in terms of the dealing with the external actors, I think the Southeast Asia have so many divergent perspectives, so that they were not able to actually come to some agreement to respond to the particular issues. So in that case, the ASEAN might not be really useful in terms of, in the Pacific region. And then third thing is this is more kind of like the what if the question, but again, Southeast Asia kind of analysis which on the U.S. policy towards in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. I think they consider there's going to be more intensification between the United States and China, and then the strategic, like intensify the strategic the competition. And I think like this is most likely to be true. But at the same time, if we could actually see the U.S. policy toward China or the U.S. Trump's kind of appointment of the senior the secretaries and also the senior officers in the department, and also some of the team's members, then there are several the people who are actually more kind of aligned or like closer to the China, such as Elon Musk. So we were not really sure like what kind of the relationship that could be built between the United States and China in the future. It's not completely the U.S. against the China. Maybe like there might be some kind of like the softer approach that the United States would take, and I think like that sense the Southeast Asia, I'm not really sure to what extent the Southeast Asia is prepared in that situation, because there's no kind of like discussion on that. So I guess those are the three kind of risks that we may face in the future, and then this would actually determine another strategic dynamics of the Indo-Pacific in the coming years. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Koga. You've also kept to the time, and thank you for that. And I think Trump 2.0 is an important aspect that where the whole world is waiting for the next set of documents that will possibly flow after 20th of January. But just to do some maybe crystal ball gazing, we could take a look at the 2019 documents issued during Trump 1.0, specifically the documents coming from the Department of Defense and the State Department, to see if Trump 2.0 will stick to whatever they had said, or will they enhance it. There is a certain amount of discussion on the hardline approach to China. You've mentioned the increase in tariffs, and then of course that's on the economic side, but what about militarily? That needs to be seen, especially after the exercises that China conducted against Taiwan in October, which saw at least around 100 plus ships and aircraft in action. And interestingly, you mentioned the end of IPEC. So first of all, how much of Biden administration will Trump 2.0 unravel and create new ones or go back? So that is a lot of speculation on the board. And I think only the future would be able to tell us. But thank you for your views. It's always welcome. And Dr. Mishra, Rahul, I think you're online. Over to you.
Good afternoon, sir. Very good to see you after really a long time, even though it is only online. And I look forward to meeting you soon. I can see Pramod also. Good to see you, Pramod. And thank you for the invitation. I think Koga-san has covered quite a good amount of ground in terms of understanding how Southeast Asia looks at the Indo-Pacific, the construct, the region, or Indo-Pacific as a strategy on all dimensions. And also how Southeast Asian countries are trying to navigate this, also using ASEAN as a platform. So I'll make 7 quick observations first, and then perhaps we can discuss more during the Q&A. The first, and perhaps also continuing from Koga-san's point, there is a clear discord between how 10 countries of Southeast Asia, and I'm excluding Myanmar and including East Timor, how these 10 countries of Southeast Asia are looking at Indo-Pacific as a possible option to construct a new region, to also try to find a balance between the US and China in terms of their superpower rivalry and competition, and how ASEAN as a regional grouping looks at Indo-Pacific as a regional construct or as an emerging regional order which can be seen as a confluence between the Indian Ocean and Asia Pacific. So economic and diplomatic confluence zone that ASEAN sees Indo-Pacific as is totally different from how Southeast Asia perceives it. So a lot of divergent opinions, divergent approaches are emerging, individual Southeast Asian countries and ASEAN as such. And you have countries like Indonesia, for example, which are very vocal, very upfront about Indo-Pacific, but you have Malaysia also, which is very cagey, if not very hesitant about Indo-Pacific. And next year, 2025, when Malaysia will be the ASEAN chair, I don't see much of Indo-Pacific happening there. We'll be talking more about de-dollarization and BRICS and a situation in the Middle East, particularly focusing on Palestine, but also creating a multipolar world order, which in many ways tries to move away from the American hegemony, American dominance. And this is going to get more amplified with Trump coming back to power. So the mood, at least in Malaysia, and Malaysia being the ASEAN chair for 2025, is very clear. Indo-Pacific is going to be seen with a much colder approach than it was when Indonesia was the ASEAN chair. The other point is that ASEAN's main flagship agenda was the ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific that was launched in 2019. Even though it did not have much of fanfare, it did receive a lot of discussion and speculation as to how ASEAN is going to have the nuts and bolts with it, create a toolbox to make ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific functional. What we have seen over the past 5 years that it's a dead horse. It has not moved even a single bit. It is a document which says, okay, we have the Indian Ocean and the Asia Pacific, and we want to make this region inclusive, peaceful, and prosperous, but nothing beyond that. So ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific is just a document with no guiding principles and nothing moving forward. Indonesia, the credit should be given where it is due. Indonesia, when it was the chair last year in 2023, did try to make Indo-Pacific more actionable and with more appeal by launching the Indo-Pacific Forum. But we noticed that Indo-Pacific Forum also has just been what most of ASEAN organizations, ASEAN institutions are, they're talking shop. So there was a lot of humdrum about Indo-Pacific Forum taking the lead and making ASEAN's Indo-Pacific approach more practical and more functional, but not much has happened on that point. So that's my second point. The third is that Southeast Asia currently is with new developments happening, with Trump administration coming to power, with countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, to a certain extent, even Philippines not being very supportive of what is happening in the Middle East, especially the Islamic countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, finding that both the US and European Union are not taking a very rules-based approach on the Middle East conflict is something that has been worrying them. And if you go through the statements, the media statements that have come from Malaysia by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim or even President Jokowi, it is very clear that they have also started questioning as to what kind of rules-based order we are talking about. Is it a rules-based order that applies only in South China Sea and not in the Middle East? Is it a rules-based order that applies when it comes to Russia-Ukraine conflict and not to other parts of the world, let's say Africa? So what kind of rules-based order we are looking at? Is it a selective rules-based order that suits the interest of the hegemonic major powers, or does it include the global South as well? Of course, this approach that Southeast Asian countries have is very emotive an approach because of religious and ethnic factors, but it has very sound footing in the global South, and we notice that in the ASEAN region, in the Southeast Asian region. So what happens to these kind of questions that have been raised by policymakers, and how Trump administration responds to that is something that is worth our attention in times to come. But that said, it's not that Indo-Pacific, the idea or institutions that are being created, all of them are given a cold shoulder. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, for example, has been received with much warmth. I mean, 7 out of 10 ASEAN countries have agreed to participate in Indo-Pacific Economic Forum. The question, most of the economists, and if you talk to Ministry of Trade and Investment in Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, they are also curious as to what steps are we going to take moving forward. Is Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, only going to be a bunch of moral homilies, or there are actionable agenda points? Are we going to curb terror finance or corruption or financial mismanagement, the role of multinational companies? How are the pillars of IPEF going to be implemented? The actionable agenda points are going to be implemented. So there's a lot of speculation on that front. But I must say that the member countries or signatories to IPEF are positive about the US. So not everything is dim and glim about the US. The fifth trend that I see in Southeast Asia with regards to Indo-Pacific is that there is a very clear sign that these countries are trying to move beyond the US-China competition, US-China binary, as it were. And if you just take a look at past 3 years, how countries like Vietnam, for example, are signing comprehensive strategic partnership agreements. Earlier, it was all focused on dialogue partners, the major powers, middle power. Japan, of course, played a very important role. But now it is moving inward. So inward spiraling of Vietnam's strategic design. Starting with the US, Russia was always there, India was always there, but also Japan, South Korea, and now gone to Malaysia. 2025, they are going to sign strategic partnership agreements with Indonesia and Singapore. So in the Southeast Asian region, we see that the role of rising powers and middle powers has become more prominent, and it is only going to grow. So, which is good news for Japan, South Korea, India, Australia. And in many ways, the Southeast Asian strategic designs, their understanding of Indo-Pacific contestation is also changing. I believe that many of these important Southeast Asian countries are also not going to just sit on the fence and do nothing. They are taking these small little steps, and they are making these baby moves in terms of getting themselves prepared or bracing themselves for more strategic contestation with Trump coming to power and Trump's ideas on multilateral trade as well. The sixth and second last point is that there are apprehensions about the US approach to multilateral trade, US approach to a liberal international order dominated by free and fair movement, free and unhindered movement of people and resources and finances. So a lot of question and a lot of concerns on how to understand the American approach to liberal international order. Because on one hand, we do keep talking about US being the torchbearer of a liberal international economic order, but on the other hand, we see that it's actually China which is offering more opportunities for Southeast Asian countries. And I see this and I say this with a neutral eye, as it were. For Southeast Asian countries, for ASEAN countries, economic prosperity and well-being of their people is more important. There, I say it's more important than their strategic considerations. Whether you go to Singapore or you go to Malaysia, economic prosperity and well-being and reaching the middle income group is something that dominates their newspapers. It's not that strategic analysts like my colleagues and I have made up. It is the predominant theme day in and day out for Southeast Asian countries. So we've got to understand that. And that is why the support for de-dollarization or BRICS Plus is so profound. Like if you have all leading countries of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, mulling over this possibility of BRICS Plus, and de-dollarization is also trading in their own currencies, that is, or a currency that is not the US dollar, is something that has gained traction. And Trump's threat alone is not going to resolve this. You need to, America and the other countries have to find ways and means to deal with this problem. The bad news there.
Rahul, could you wrap up, please?
I'll take just 30 seconds, sir. So the bad news there is that countries like India are also supportive of this idea. And so are a number of Asian countries, the major powers. So I think that is something that we have to take note of. Finally, I think looking forward to while Southeast Asian countries are looking forward to the changes in American and European politics, and they hope that there will be continuity rather than drastic changes with Trump coming to power. They are bracing themselves to this new change. But I think overall in the Indo-Pacific dynamics, there's continuity for them. There is more hesitation and more uncertainty for Southeast Asian countries, a trend that is likely to continue in 25 and beyond. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul. Stirring the hornet's nest as always, but thank you. Your, I think, views will tickle the audience and invite questions. And I quite like the manner in which you said divergent views between ASEAN and an organization and independent nations. I think there's a parallel the way at which EU and European nations also perhaps look at this region. And so therefore, there is certain convergences there. AOIP, well, I would tend to agree with you that I think it needs a relook, as does the ASEAN Maritime Outlook. It has to be more specific to the Indo-Pacific. That was a certain viewpoint when both these documents came out, and efficacy and applicability of rules-based order is always an issue. And middle powers rise is there. Of course, three main nations of the Quad are middle powers. We are placidly moving up the ladder as satisfied nations, but then of course we do have a voice in the Indo-Pacific, and I'm sure you'll invite a lot of questions, and I'll give you some time, all speakers in the end, to give their final views, so anything left out. And Dr. Hayton, over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair. It's a pleasure to be here, see some old friends and some new faces. I thought I'd sort of focus a bit on some of the specifics, and I imagine that Lucio is going to talk a fair bit about Philippines. I thought I'd just talk a little bit about Vietnam and how things are going in the South China Sea at the moment. There's obviously been a major transition in the Vietnamese Communist Party leadership over the past year or so. And it's interesting to think about how that might affect what Vietnam does in the region. I think primarily the most important thing to think about here is that, for Vietnam, the most important factor is what is good for the Communist Party. And that always has to be the frame of reference, I think, that we use when we look at Vietnam's relations with both China, the US, and also with its other partners in the region and outside. So when you look at where the clashes, the sources of tension are in the South China Sea, the important thing I think to recognize is that they are all at the extremity of China's U-shaped line. They are the areas where that U-shaped line overlaps with exclusive economic zones claimed from the Southeast Asian countries, whether that be off the coast of Vietnam or off Indonesia, Malaysia, or indeed the Philippines, which I'm sure we'll hear more about from Lucio shortly. And this, of course, is a legacy of this 9-dash line, U-shaped line, which has appeared on Chinese maps since 1948. And this line continues to play to act in Chinese thinking as some kind of boundary, even though there is no known legal basis, no justification for it officially from China. And you can see where where China has engaged in seismic surveys against Southeast Asian countries, and you can see how the Coast Guard, the China Coast Guard, and its survey vessels use this line as an actual boundary. It's quite clear. As we know, the Philippines took China to an international arbitral tribunal to rule, and the tribunal ruled in 2016 that this kind of behavior was unlawful. But of course, that hasn't stopped anything. So looking at Vietnam's overall strategic position, as this map shows, on paper at least, Vietnam has a very strong position, occupies more than half of the features in the Spratly Islands, and as we know, has been building up its the capabilities of its bases quite significantly in recent weeks. We've seen signs of new airfield perhaps being built on Bark Canada Reef down here, in addition to the existing runway here on Spratly Island, and other signs of upgrades as well. And what's interesting here, I think, to me, is that whereas China has been punishing the Philippines for its activities on the the second Thomas Shoal, over here in this area of the sea, we've had clashes between Chinese and Philippine coast guards, very dramatic ones threatening to escalate. Vietnam has been able to upgrade its bases here without, it seems, any comeback from China at all. And it does seem to me that it's often been the case that China treats different ASEAN claimants in different ways at different times. But I do wonder whether this has been a sort of legacy of some kind of understanding that was reached between the Chinese and Vietnamese Communist parties. Vietnam has in effect abandoned almost all of its oil and gas exploration inside the U-shaped line. And so I go back, whereas the Philippines hasn't. And I think, well, there are two factors, I think, in the Philippines. One is this idea that the Philippines wants to develop oil and gas reserves inside China's claimed line over here. Plus also there's the element of the Taiwan and the US-China mutual defense treaty affecting those calculations, whereas it seems to be treating Vietnam differently. So Vietnam, is facing an economic, choke point, I suppose you might say. Rapidly rising economic growth. Things are looking good, but it's having an energy shortage. And so one of the reasons it's got this energy shortage is that China has successfully stopped Vietnam from developing offshore oil and gas reserves. So 2 years ago, Indonesia and Vietnam agreed their maritime boundary here, which unlocked, this is the area of the Indonesian exclusive economic zone, which overlaps with the Chinese claim line, U-shaped line here. And Vietnam and Indonesia had long been in dispute about where this boundary was here. That was finally settled 2 years ago. That then unlocked the idea that the tuna block, not a gas field, could be developed, and the gas would then be piped to Vietnam, and that would help to unblock some of Vietnam's electricity problems. And this has angered China. China immediately sent its largest Coast Guard ship, the world's largest Coast Guard ship, down there to patrol the area and to intimidate Vietnam. But insofar, Indonesia and Vietnam seem to be holding firm on this. And I think this is, a sign of a crisis, a further crisis to come, perhaps. We look at what happened in a different area of the sea. This is Vietnam's southeastern coast here. Back in the in 2018, 2017, Vietnam was forced to cancel gas drills down here, and another one in 2020, because they were all on the wrong side of China's U-shaped line. So I think Vietnam is hoping that Indonesia will take the flak for developing a bit further south and west in the tuna block area here. But I think a sort of some kind of crunch is coming here. There are other places where Vietnam and China have potential flashpoints, I think, also around the edges of the U-shaped line. Vietnam and China have agreed their maritime boundary between up to this point at the mouth of the Tonkin Gulf, but the problem has always been how to extend this boundary line further. The logical halfway point would be to go in this direction, but because there is a dash of the 9-dash line here, China wants the line to come down here. So this rather small but very politically sensitive triangle of sea here is a problem, because there are, again, oil and gas fields in this area. I've enlarged them here. So this little area here is a potential flashpoint too. And then further down the south, you've got another extension of the U-shaped line. And again, we've got potential clashes down here. So all of these are potential places where Vietnam and China could clash. This is where China has drawn its own oil and gas blocks over the top of Vietnam's oil and gas blocks. The problem of course of Vietnam is how it continues to fuel its economic growth, and one of its responses has been to increase the construction of coal-fired power stations, which it's not supposed to be doing, given its commitments under the, for example, the the Just Energy Transition Partnership with its G8 partners. But it seems that because of China's blocking of gas exploitation in the South China Sea, Vietnam is turning or relying more on coal for its energy transition. This is the Philippines, this is Batangas, and maybe Lucio will address some of this in his presentation. But it's interesting to think, I think, about how China's actions in the South China Sea are changing the energy dynamics of several countries. So the Philippines used to be able to rely on the Malampaya gas field for a fifth of its electricity generation, and that has declined rapidly. But rather than being able to develop its own indigenous resources in the South China Sea under the Reed Bank, Philippines has had to turn to importing LNG, liquefied natural gas, from places like Australia. So rather than having an energy resource under its own control, which generates revenue for the government and doesn't pose currency problems, for example, balance of trade problems, it's now reliant on imports on the international markets and all the rest of it. And Vietnam is going the same way. Rather than being able to exploit its own offshore gas resources, it's having to import from elsewhere, which has been good news for Japanese and other energy companies, but maybe bad news for the Vietnamese state budget and its own energy security. So these are having, I think, long-term consequences on the nature of strategic calculations in the South China Sea. So the new leadership, here's To Lum, the new General Secretary of the Communist Party on the left here, visiting Beijing in August. And the real question is, which way is Vietnam going to turn? To Lum is a man from the Public Security Ministry, a general. He is one of, I think, 8 police and military army generals in the, when I say police, I mean public security.
Dr. Hayton, could I request you to just, thank you.
Right. Okay. So this is the big question. We could leave it open. Which way is Vietnam going to flip when it comes, or is it going to? We hear a lot about bamboo diplomacy. Is it really bamboo, or is it really going to be a lean towards China? We can maybe talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and that's some enriching slides, and again, most welcome change to the thought process. I was like your parity as to what is good for the Communist Party for Vietnam, sort of on the lines of how China's Communist Party also operates is there. And Well, the design, the modern art design, which the seismic vessels are doing in the South China Sea, is, I dare say, the research vessels in the Indian Ocean region would soon be depicting a similar pattern because that presence is increasing out there. Um, Vietnam's upgrading of bases, military infrastructure. If you remember, some time back, China had said, "Why are you pointing the finger at me? I'm the only, not the only nation who's doing it, but it is the national interests of all nations that come about." And therefore, the different approach, say, between what Vietnam and Philippines, which you mentioned, perhaps the cozying up of relations between the US and the Philippines once again has China worried, and therefore they are more what do you call more kinetic actions against Philippines. We've had some very close calls in the recent past, something they did with Vietnam earlier, but perhaps the Vietnam reaction was more kinetic than the Philippines. Similarly, what, if you remember, Indonesia had done off the Natuna Islands when they had burnt one or two, I think, fishing vessels, and now they are also upgrading their military infrastructure on the Natuna Island itself. And more recently, if you remember, last month, China has declared its baselines around the Scarborough Reef. And it's actually come out with the coordinates, which perhaps changes the equation. Is that if it goes ahead with ADIZs in the South China Sea, for which you need to have certain sovereign claims on that, but we can discuss that later. The setting up of baselines around a particular island, which is still disputed, is perhaps a step for them to enforce their sovereignty and go ahead with all the aspects that are related to sovereignty, which will perhaps only add to the ongoing instability in the South China Sea. But that is another point for which we can discuss later. And thank you so much for your views on that. Dr. Nagy, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much to the organization for hosting this wonderful event. I have 4 points that I want to cover. One is related to the heterogeneity of Southeast Asia or ASEAN. Second, looking at how reading the Southeast Asian tea leaves, which I think is really important. 3, I would like to talk about some ways to engage with Southeast Asia. And lastly, I guess the way forward. So thinking about the region itself, it is very heterogeneous. And, when we look at the Philippines, for example, unilateral cooperation with Japan and the United States, it is by far the exception in terms of how other Southeast Asian countries are forward-leaning in terms of dealing with some of the challenges of China. And then we see Vietnam, as Bill touched upon, at the same time resisting China's South China Sea expansion, at the same time engaging with Xi Jinping in January 2024 with a state visit. So we see very different approaches within the region. I think that recognizing the heterogeneity of the region is really important in terms of how extra-regional partners, whether it's India, Canada, where I'm from, or Japan, are engaging with the region, is that we can't have a one-brush fits-all approach to engaging with the region. Second, I think it's really important for us to be thinking about and understanding, again, the geopolitical tea leaves within the region. There's some very useful surveys. ASEAN's People's Survey, the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies Survey of Southeast Asia, as well as the China ASEAN Southeast ASEAN survey, which all demonstrate that the region has a very nuanced view about US-China competition, about the importance of engaging with both. And I think when we drill down into each of these surveys, what we see is that these countries look for their economic lifeline to China, but without a doubt, they want to anchor the United States within the region, and they have different degrees of support for some of the new mini-lateral partnerships that have emerged, whether it's the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, the mini-lateral partnership that was signed between Washington, Manila, and Tokyo in May 2024, or the recent Quad activities that Southeast Asian countries are looking for the United States to be anchored into the region. They are also leaning, in my view, towards a stronger anchored US within the region. And here again, I'd like to go back to Bill's point on Vietnam. Before Vietnam welcomed Xi Jinping to Hanoi back in January, it welcomed the Vice President of the United States. It welcomed the President. They set up a Center of Disease Control. They signed the Vietnam EU Free Trade Agreement. They're very, very active in building a balancing structure to be able to engage with China with a position of strength. So again, I think as we look through the region, it's important for us to be able to understand that each country within the region has very different understandings of the importance of China, the importance of the United States, how they lean towards different extra-regional partners, and how they continue to try and build extra-regional balancing structures within the region to ensure that they have the maximum amount of strategic autonomy. Third, I think it's important for us to look at how countries are engaging with Southeast Asia, and it is a multilateral, multi-level engagement. They continue to pay respect towards ASEAN centrality, moving forward with the so-called ASEAN consensus-based decision-making. But at the same time, they're very, very, very realistic about the problems with ASEAN centrality or ASEAN consensus-based decision-making. And this is why we've seen the emergence of mini-lateral partnerships within the region. Mini-lateral partnerships are regionally focused. They're functional cooperation that are meant to tackle a specific problem. In some ways, it's burden sharing to ensure that the United States doesn't have to manage the whole region. That's no longer possible. The same way, there's more realistic understanding that to deal with challenges, for example, in the so-called East Filipino Sea, likely you're going to need a mini-lateral partnership focuses specifically on that. We also see mini-lateral partnerships not only focus on maritime initiatives, but focusing on infrastructure and connectivity, focusing on technology, and focusing on security. And I encourage you to look at the Philippines, US, Japan joint statement that was released in May 2024 as evidence of that. So mini-lateral partnerships are really emerging, and they're going to continue to emerge, and we're going to see new formulas emerge to deal with some of the challenges within the Southeast Asia. And I'm going to come back to that at the end. Lastly, and I think importantly, we continue to see strong bilateral engagement with each country within the region. Japan, where I'm usually situated, is an excellent example of that, providing ODA and FDI to countries like the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, to help build an alternative supply chain and production network. I didn't say decouple, but an alternative one to start to build a more selective but diversified set of supply chains throughout Southeast Asia and eventually to India. This is meant to deleverage some of the vulnerabilities associated with the supply chain being over-concentrated in China. So bilateral engagement is also very important. Moving forward, I think as we think about how to engage with Southeast Asia, I think it's really critical that we look to key partners. Again, if we're looking for a more forward-leaning partner, the Philippines has shown that, at least under the current Marcos administration. Whether that will continue, that's a different story. Vietnam is a leader in terms of selective diversification away from China and its supply chains, but that has limitations because of its size, population, and of course, emerging governance challenged domestically in Vietnam. There's also questions about ASEAN centrality. How much do we engage with ASEAN as an organization, or do we start to invest in ASEAN minus to be able to be a practical problem solver? It's unlikely that ASEAN is going to be able to deal with the challenges of Myanmar by itself. But if we're thinking about the South China Sea, does an ASEAN minus formula work? And what is the best way to deal with that? As we look to investing in ASEAN as an institution or an association, but also investing within the region, I think that there's some excellent patterns to be able to do that. I'm going to use the example of Japan, where I'm based, because I think it is a bridge builder, or it's an international connector. It's using infrastructure connectivity investments to build and enhance intra-ASEAN economic integration. This is important. The more ASEAN is integrated, the more Southeast Asian countries are integrated, they'll have more strategic autonomy because they have more economic choices. Public good provision is also an important example of that. It could be health infrastructure, education infrastructure, or other forms of infrastructure. We do have outside players that I think are emerging as an important but very narrow contributor to the region. For example, Canada has come into the region providing dark vessel technology to deal with illegal, unregulated, and undocumented fishing. While a small contribution to the region, this is a welcome contribution for the Philippines, Vietnam, and Indonesia. And this is a possible minilateral partnership moving forward to, again, provide some more public good provision to the region in a minilateral format. The EU, India, Australia all have an opportunity to engage in the minilateral partnerships that are emerging within the region to help stabilize the issues, to help strengthen cooperation within the region, but again, deal with the challenges that Southeast Asian countries are facing: development, security, and sustainable economic development. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagy, for being on time again. And I think it's you brought us some very relevant aspects, especially the Southeast Asia surveys that have been carried out, and of course the China being the economic lifeline, which I think was very clear in the State of Southeast Asia report that came out with through ISEAS recently. And of course, the anchorage of US in the region is again equally important, and that comes to the balancing that ASEAN nations have to do. And of course, the minilateral approach, which can plug many gray areas or address weak areas that not only ASEAN, but I dare say most of a lot of the organizations in the Indo-Pacific would benefit from. And especially the Japanese approach and the bilateralism that is taking place, and of course the ASEAN centrality aspect which you brought in, as well as the importance of intra-ASEAN integration. That's always work in progress. And thank you so much for your views. And over to Ms. Joanne Weiling, please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and very good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning to all of you. I hope you can hear me well. Sorry, before I go into like sharing some of my thoughts, can I just check how long do I have?
You have 10 minutes.
10 minutes, and we can talk about any topics that we want, right?
Absolutely, which
Okay.
Southeast Asian and the Indo-Pacific is the theme. So.
Yeah, thank you. So since I'm actually from the ASEAN Study Center, and I actually heard a lot of speakers also mentioning about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific, I think I'll just make a few points on really what is ASEAN's role in the Indo-Pacific, and really how important it is, and really how can we use the AOIP to really advance ASEAN's interests. So I would say that ASEAN is an important player because geographically the region is at the heart of the Indian and the Pacific Ocean, and Dr. Rahul has mentioned earlier that really ASEAN is where the confluence, of the two oceans is. And of course, the Indo-Pacific is important to ASEAN for many reasons, and we have heard that one is really the economic lifeline. And we know that the region's sea lane, including the South China Sea, are very vital to ASEAN's trade and, of course, energy security. But also, the Indo-Pacific is really a region that I would say is characterized by geopolitical rivalries. And I would say that the Indo-Pacific is really the stage, right now where great power rivalries play out, particularly between US and China. And I think for ASEAN, maintaining a neutral and balanced stance is very crucial to preserving its autonomy and unity. And this is something that the region is trying to adjust to, because I think as all of us know that before we even heard about the Indo-Pacific, we call ourselves the Asia-Pacific. And the Asia-Pacific is really known for its economic cooperation and joint prosperity. I mean, we are a very pragmatic region. As previous speakers have mentioned, we really much prefer economic cooperation rather than, to be engaging with this sort of increased rivalry. And of course, another reason is because of the increasing transboundary challenges like climate change, IUU fishing, illegal fishing, disaster management, and all these issues, of course, demand regional solutions. And ASEAN's convening powers, through our ASEAN-led mechanisms, makes ASEAN a uniquely positioned organization to really address all these shared challenges. And of course, ASEAN wants to be a driving force. So that's why you always hear about the term ASEAN centrality. and it has sought to position itself as a key player in shaping the Indo-Pacific future through the ASEAN Outlook on the Indo-Pacific that was actually adopted in 2019. So we are actually about 5 years into the implementation, and of course the question is that most people ask is really how effective it is, which I want to address in a while. So I think what is important about the AOIP is that it actually underscores the inclusivity and cooperation that ASEAN's really desire, such as in the 4 priority areas like maritime cooperation, connectivity, sustainable development, and economic collaboration. And all this cooperation, should preferably, be undertaken through ASEAN-led mechanisms like the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, which consists of many of ASEAN's dialogue partners, including India, Japan, and so on. So, of course, promoting the AOIP has not been really without its challenges, because ASEAN really operates on the principle of consensus, and many speakers have mentioned that earlier. And of course, what is challenging in the Indo-Pacific is that its member states do not accord equal priority to the principles or the strategies on the Indo-Pacific. So while countries like, of course, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines actively supports the AOIP to really assert their strategic importance and secure their maritime interests, as like Bill has also mentioned earlier about the South China Sea, I think there are also countries like Laos, for example, that takes really a less proactive stance, because we know that Laos is really a landlocked nation, and Indo-Pacific is really important where the maritime domain is concerned. So Laos has actually fewer direct states in maritime cooperation, which is a major pillar of the AOIP, I would say. But instead, the priorities lies in its connectivity and sustainable development, reflecting really the geographical realities and the development needs of this country, and maybe also other countries in Southeast Asia. So, of course, despite this sort of differences, I would say that ASEAN has really made some significant strides in operationalizing the AOIP. And we talked about it earlier under Indonesia's chairmanship in 2023. There was the ASEAN Indo-Pacific Forum that was launched to really foster collaboration in areas like the green infrastructure, like digital transformation and sustainable development. And quite amazingly, we didn't think that Laos would be doing anything this year because, it doesn't have a great stake in the Indo-Pacific concept, but it actually continued the effort by hosting another Indo-Pacific forum, of course, with a stronger focus on like connectivity and economic resilience. And that's given, of course, Laos a unique position as a landlocked nation. So it actually emphasizes the infrastructure projects that actually links the ASEAN economies, particularly through initiatives like the Laos-China Railway and other transportation network. So I would also like to talk a little bit on how ASEAN can increase its cooperation with the dialogue partners through the AOIP, because as the previous speaker, Dr. Rahul, has mentioned, like he said that we haven't really seen anything, that's really coming out of it. So maybe I can suggest some ways, like, perhaps how, the AOIP can actually become useful for ASEAN. And simply because like, the AOIP is really one of the key initiatives that we have now, and our Singapore government calls it omnidirectional. So it's really not targeted at any nations. And it actually can help to foster collaboration with all dialogue partners. In fact, China actually has a statement with ASEAN on the AOIP, and China is, of course, at least like the last candidate that you think that, would be interested in this. But it's also part of it. And I think that's also because a significant aspect of this concept, this AOIP, lies in its rhetoric and the principles that are reflected in the various statements that includes the respect for international law, inclusivity, transparency, etc. So, but of course, course, well, I mean, there's a lot being said, and there's a lot of statements that have been made by various dialogue partners. In fact, I would say that these are standalone statements. I think the substantive outcomes are really underwhelming, and I think this reflects on the nature of the AOIP as a symbol of ASEAN's aspiration, rather than really offering a concrete pathway to achieve some specific outcomes. So, of course, the question that everybody has here is really about the AOIP's effectiveness in shaping the regional architecture, whether it's able to really mitigate major power rivalries or to sort of deter security threats, like simply because it actually lacks a strategic trust within it, and definitely is not an instrument to counter China as well. So we see that in many of the Indo-Pacific strategies of major powers, but definitely not in the AOIP. So in short, I think despite the many processes surrounding the initiative, it is really insufficient to tackle security issues, and ASEAN would need to think about ways to bring strategic value to the AOIP beyond functional cooperation. This is something that ASEAN will need to think about. But of course, what ASEAN has done well is, of course, in the areas of coming up with certain, like, for example, I'll just give an example of
But I
what
request you
Indonesia did.
to wrap up, please, Ms. Weiling.
Okay, I will. So I think what I want to say is that the AOIP value can increase if there was really a more systematic and synergized approach to cooperation. And dialogue partners shouldn't be sort of competing with each other to see who has more activities, who can do more with ASEAN, but really they should identify really something that is more strategic, identify the appropriate partners. I mean, ASEAN should identify the appropriate partners to implement specific projects based on the strength and suitability of each country. And I think there should be more customized approach to the AOIP in moving forward. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your views and coming to the defense of AOIP so strongly. And of course, there needs to be a relook, I think. And of course, it will not only advance ASEAN centrality, but also enable perhaps balancing of the great power rivalries you mentioned and enhancing economic cooperation. And I do hope that your pointers are taken up by ASEAN. And of course, it's a very important organization at the heart of the Indo-Pacific. And thank you for your views. And over to Mr. Lucio Pitlo.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to join this conversation. Happy to see old friends, and of course, happy to greet and meet new ones. So, what I'm going to share are some of my personal thoughts on AOIP. So, following on some of the points made by Joanne earlier, and also some points that were also touched upon by previous speakers. So certainly Southeast Asia is at the center of the Indo-Pacific or of the Asia-Pacific because of its strategic location, its of course vibrant democracies among members of ASEAN, also their economies, very young demography, the presence of flashpoints, the diversity of levels of economic development, as well as political and governance system in the region. Yet, despite of these variances, the region was able to focus pretty much on economic development for the most part of in the past decades. Of course, recent challenges in terms of the external environment would put pressure on that. So the ASEAN outlook in the Indo-Pacific is a response to this external pressure, partly, in great part. So, but even before the launch of the Indo-Pacific strategy by a number of countries, including able partners of ASEAN, Southeast Asia is already the focus of many overtures by its partners. For instance, China's 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. You have the U.S. Blue Dot Network. You have India's Look East and then Act East policy. You have Korea's new southbound policy and its new incarnation. the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, among others. So in keeping with ASEAN's time-honored tradition of inclusivity, openness to various initiatives and groups that offer benefit to the region, this outreach from partners were welcome. But as some of these visions or strategies, sometimes they clash or contrast. ASEAN avoid openly endorsing one. So when major and middle powers from near and far launched their Indo-Pacific strategies, ASEAN came up with its own in 2019. ASEAN does not want to be just a mere taker, but instead wants to be an active shaper of the region's evolving economic, security, and even technology order. So the AOIP is an assertion of autonomy and agency in a fast-changing landscape featuring intensifying geopolitical rivalry and the rise of multipolarity, with emerging economies, including in ASEAN, wanting to grow their regional, if not their global profiles. ASEAN wants to temper geopolitical rivalries. It understands it has no control over this dynamic, but it desires to channel the competition in more productive areas like trade, investment, and infrastructure, as well as platforms to discuss rules of the road for instance, new emerging technologies. ASEAN continues to avoid taking sides, but instead benefit from all partners, welcoming initiatives from all of them. But external pressures like the competition among its major partners may either soften ASEAN cohesion or it may force ASEAN to double down on its centrality. Again, ASEAN is diverse, it's very heterogeneous. There is a spectrum of views on certain issues, for instance, attitudes towards security unilaterals, as well as the trust and confidence or the depth of ties in working with certain partners. There are forward-leaning countries, and there are those who have long traditions of non-alignment. But this, of course, these positions are not static. So the challenge will be, or the question will be, whether those that stay largely in the middle, will they be able to pull or restrain the outliers and keep them within the group? AOIP have outlined 4 areas of maritime cooperation. One of them is in the maritime domain. So we see this already taking place in terms of partners stepping up to support, for instance, the Coast Guard capacity buildup of littoral states in the South China Sea, like in the case of Japan's official security assistance to the Philippines and Malaysia, as well as support for financing of the construction of maritime law enforcement ships by Philippines and Vietnam. And of course, aside from support for capacity buildup, we also see, of course, asset transfers, donations of decommissioned ships, which are still very seaworthy and very well maintained. And of course, in the form of joint exercises, joint sails, and patrols. And of course, support for maritime domain awareness, the case of Canada's dark vessel technology, or the capability to be able to detect ships even though they turn off their AIS. So these are welcome initiatives and will go a long way in helping countries like the Philippines improve their capacity to guard their vast maritime domain 24/7. And of course, aside from maritime cooperation, connectivity is already there. So infrastructure support from partners of ASEAN like China, its Belt and Road Initiative. It's of course something that many countries in the region welcome. And aside from connectivity, the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2030, the attainment of these UN SDGs also form an integral goal area of cooperation between ASEAN and its partners. So of great interest for many ASEAN countries is, of course, the fight against climate change and of course the promotion of more sustainable, more greener forms of energy and mobility. So of course, China is emerging as an active player in this space, but other partners are also, of course, doing their share to support ASEAN countries as they try to increase the share of renewables in their national energy mix, as well as to set up their, of course, EV transition, the road to um, lessen gas powered vehicles on the streets, and of course other economic and possible areas of cooperation. So it's quite broad. The terms, the areas of cooperation that AOIP outlined in this document with partners is broad. So in terms of the implementation, some recent developments can be seen as part and parcel of implementing AOIP. For instance, RCEP, which entered into force in 2022. It's now the world's largest FTA. And of course, while other ASEAN partners were behind supporting this endeavor, of course, it's very much also ASEAN led and ASEAN centered. And last year, ASEAN made outreach and signed a memorandum of understanding with two other regional organizations, the Pacific Island Forum to its east and the Indian Ocean Rim Association to its west. And so these two organizations are also of developing countries. They share common challenges like, of course, the risk from climate change, and also they have developmental needs similar to countries in ASEAN. In fact, some members, a couple of ASEAN countries are also members of IORAM. And last year, ASEAN also had its first summit with Gulf Cooperation Council countries in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So this is part of ASEAN's outreach with other regional organizations to suggest, that it is open to more partners, and this includes organizations that can provide benefits to the region in economic or security terms. So in the last Indo-Pacific Forum held in Indonesia, hosted by Indonesia during its chairmanship, where the theme was ASEAN Matters, epicentrum of growth. Among the priorities outlined back then was green infrastructure and resilient supply chain, inclusive digital transformation, sustainable and innovative financing, and creative economy. And so apart from this, some members of ASEAN on their own have also taken steps, to expand their economic partnerships. So the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework counts 7 ASEAN members. CPTPP has 4 ASEAN members. DEPA, of course, Singapore is there, and this platform, this partnership will grow. It's bound to grow. It's looking for ways to extend its membership. Now, for the Philippines, where I am from, of course, the Indo-Pacific Business Forum was co-hosted by the Philippines last May. And of course, there was already mention about the Luzon Economic Corridor, which is, it was announced during the trilateral summit between the presidents, heads of state of US, Japan, and the Philippines.
Could I ask you to wrap up, please, Mr.
Sure.
Pitlo?
Thank you. So Luzon Economic Corridor is also part of it. And of course, just recently, the Coalition for Emerging Market Infrastructure Investment. Of course, these initiatives will help in addressing the country's infrastructure deficit. So for ASEAN, I think there's concern about, the volatility or unpredictability of the external environment with leadership change in a major partner like the US, the concern about potential economic pressure, and of course, the need to diversify to spread risks will be there. Of course, ASEAN is a grouping of developing countries They will continue to court investments from all, diversify and spread the risks, and be pragmatic and always on the look for opportunities, calibrate their policy when necessary, and of course, always be active, bending where the wind goes, but at the same time, of course, trying to root their principles on firm ground. Although, again, that would be difficult moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is a refreshing reminder of how AOIP has also worked. And I was quite taken in by the various MOUs, and you mentioned the RCEP, and the MOUs between PIF and IORA will obviously work wonders. And the addressal of non-traditional threats, which is a common agenda across the board. And your mention of the GCC, well, that's an area that transcends the geographical area of the Indo-Pacific as defined by many nations except a few, India as being one of them. And of course, economic development is always the main issue on the agenda. It can be a big integrating factor as also an area of cooperation and perhaps healthy cooperation, not to call it conflict per se. But thank you for your views. And last speaker, Mr. Satrialka-Tip, its floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Captain Parmar and Sumitra from the organizer for having me in such an illustrious forums, and greetings of peace for the other colleagues. Thank you so much for your views about the Southeast Asia or ASEAN Indo-Pacific outlook. I think I do not need to dwell deep into that because most of the speakers have delved deep into what AOIP is and what is the intentions or the strategic imaginations of Southeast Asia in the regions, but to be able to not just to be different from the other speaker, but also to provide more nuanced discussions. I would like to focus my explanations on the Indonesia's geostrategic imagination in the Pacific, how Indonesia really view Indo-Pacific and leading to the establishments of the AOIP itself. I think the idea of AOIP has not been spoken quite widely because AOIP is not a surprise to ASEAN and also to the Southeast Asia regions, because the idea of the Indonesia's of ASEAN's geostrategic imaginations in the Pacific, traces back in 2014. As a reactions to the confluence between the two seas speech by Shinzo Abe, and also the pivot to Asia speech by Hillary Clinton. And at that time, Indonesia took initiatives that we can no longer be reactionary in our policy, on our foreign policy. So Indonesia at that time initiated the Indo-Pacific Friendship Framework, that from time to time evolving to the idea to discuss about the potential emergence of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. So in Indonesia perspective itself, when Indonesia initiated discussions of AOIP back in 2018, 1 year before the AOIP being launched. So Indonesia's idea was always to focus on in the inclusivity and open region for cooperations. So this is this is the very signature of Indonesian foreign policy, is to counter the narrative of conflict into or competitions to cooperations. And also the second point is to create Indo-Pacific that is rule-based order or rule-based regional architectures, which has also been explained by previous speakers. We will discuss in depth into that later on. But it is also a platform where Indonesia wants Indo-Pacific to be a region of dialogue and cooperation instead of rivalry, which is the main premise of ASEAN cooperations. And as rightly mentioned by previous speakers, I think Joanne rightly mentions that the core interest of ASEAN state is to promote development and prosperity. Although in AOIP it is said that the objective is also to maintain geopolitical rivalry, but suffice to say that the cooperative elements is something that is really attracted most intra-ASEAN member states. So I think it is suffice to say that AOIP goals are very normative. the main criticisms that when AOIP came in place, that whether or not this document is going to be another platform of a norm setting exercise by ASEANs. So I think this is the right time for us to evaluate, after 6 years of the launch, whether AOIP is a mere norm setting exercise, or there are some major developments or major achievements from the documents. So I think it is very important to remember that AOIP, or the ASEAN Outlook or Indo-Pacific, is an outlook. It is not a strategy. It is not a method. It is not a strategic approach, but it is mainly an outlook. By mean of outlook is ASEAN or Indonesia or ASEAN wants to create the documents where to manage the expectations of intra-ASEAN state or extra-ASEAN states on what ASEAN can and cannot do in the regions. And as rightly mentioned by previous speakers, that AOIP after 6 years has not really gone beyond its norm exercise power. So it still struggled to form to form a cooperative arrangement in so many strategic issues. This is also mainly, I think, because of the COVID-19. I think right after the AOIP being launched, there was a huge diversion in COVID, because we know that after a year of being launched, ASEAN was planning to have an infrastructure and connectivity forum, to really strategically lay down what ASEAN needs to, what ASEAN can really contribute in the Indo-Pacific region. So this diversion was a huge a challenge intra and beyond ASEAN's, to really show up what ASEAN contribution is in the region. So I think going forward, I think ASEAN needs to reformulate its priority areas of cooperations in AOIP. I think as beautiful as it is, as comprehensive as it is, I think ASEAN cooperative arrangement has also its own limits. I think ASEAN needs to pay attention to three strategic issues in international or regional security. One is to promote. One is to work on the issue of territorial integrity in South China Sea. Although so many different views, intra-ASEAN or extra-ASEAN, I think we have seen ASEAN countries, especially ASEAN maritime powers such as Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, becoming more and more common and more have more and more shared interests in the South China Sea, as they are trying to bilaterally manage their territorial water and continental shelf, as also Captain Parmar mentions. That Indonesia was very bullish and very very strong on maintaining the territorial integrity of North Natuna Seas. So this is very synonymous what is happening between in Vietnam and Philippines as well. And Indonesia has concluded 12 years of negotiation also with Vietnam last year. Eventually we have settled the territorial dispute once and for all, which is a good news for the intra-ASEAN relations, that going forward we can have more and more shared interests and commonalities vis-a-vis China or the United States in the regions. The second issues, I think that ASEAN needs to prioritize in the implementations of AIP is in its response to the issues of Myanmar refugees and forced migrations, because I think despite very slow progress in the region, I think now ASEAN has started to move to a progressive discussions whether or not the regions or is trying to invite more actors like ICG to conduct investigations and to help ASEAN to manage disputes in Myanmar, because the forced migrations has really disrupted the relationship not only intra-ASEAN but also between ASEAN and its South Asia neighbors like India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh especially. And also the third, I think, working agenda that is very important to ASEAN is the admissions of Timor-Leste. I think Malaysia is going to have a very large stakes in the admission of Timor-Leste next year because it is coming to conclusions. However, there is also growing pessimism that we see in the past, especially from Singapore, that was very vocal about whether or not the admissions of Timor-Leste is going to be very constructive to ASEAN, because the last thing ASEAN want to see is for Timor-Leste to become another liability to ASEAN. That is also a very point. I think as mentioned also by previous speakers, I think I have to agree that AOIP is still yet to chart a clear guidance to what ASEAN can achieve in Indo-Pacific. In Indo-Pacific, I think ASEAN needs to stop being reactionary in its regional policy. Try to build a narrative beyond just competing between managing the great power rivalry. I think if ASEAN continues to become reactionary in its regional policy, it will dilute the convening power of ASEAN, to respond to standalone growing minilateral groups such as the Quad and AUKUS. So I think ASEAN needs to be more and more effective in its priority agendas and try to have to go beyond the narrative of neutrality. I think ASEAN needs to have its own strategic agenda beyond managing two great power rivalries. So there's also questions from the previous speakers whether or not ASEAN is yet to ensure a rule-based order. I think it is also very true, but I think also UNCLOS of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, from my point of view, should be a very bare minimum, realistic standard of a rule-based order, because this is the only, I think, acceptable, international law, principle or document that is, being upheld very high by ASEAN member states, and also the three maritime powers, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines, when they are winning their claims against China, has been able to use UNCLOS, effectively to win their territorial water. So this is also become a self accountability or self reflection for me as Indonesia, because the recent development between Indonesia and China regarding the overlapping claim in the South China Sea regarding the North Natuna joint development plan. So this is also something that we need to give ourselves a progressive criticism, because it failed to to meet the very objective of ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. But I think it is too soon for us to be conclusive, because we have two generals at the forefront of our policy. It's President Prabowo and Minister Sugiono, who are both from military background, and it is too naive for them to lose territorial areas, and because as two military generals, that is the last thing that they want to see. So it remains to be seen whether or not Indonesia is going to flex its muscle when the other Chinese vessel invasion is coming to Natuna, or it is going to be the first diplomatic disaster by these administrations. So I think to wrap up my point, I think to also respect the time, I think maritime domain needs to be the center focus of ASEAN implementations in Indo-Pacific. As much as we love prosperity and economic development, I think territorial integrity comes first, especially for maritime power, in order to to really have significant contributions in the implementations of AIP, because that is something that I think observers, scholars, and citizens in general wants to see from ASEAN. So speaking of sovereignty, I would like to raise my case to the moderator. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we've covered a lot of ground. And as I don't see any questions, we will let the audience gather their thoughts. I'll take the prerogative as chair to field a few questions for all the speakers. And if there are any views that you wanted to express, and apologies for cutting short on your time, you may like to express them. So I have 4 questions. And so the first one is the State of Southeast Asia survey that was recently taken, placed China as #1 at most of the whatever the surveys they carried out. And so is this a good sign for ASEAN that while China is the main economic partner, it is also the biggest threat, challenge, and risk? So are there any views on this that does this help ASEAN? Does it weaken ASEAN? How does it help ASEAN's position or Southeast Asia's position in the Indo-Pacific? Second question is on the code of conduct. And if you could just share your views. Dr. Nagy, you want me to repeat? All right, right. So the recent State of Southeast Asia survey that was carried out, no, it put China almost at #1 with a close contender of the US in all the aspects that were covered. So considering that China is referred to as the main economic partner for ASEAN, while also being one of the main reasons of threats, challenges, and risks in the region, how does this augur for ASEAN? Is there a lesson to be learned here? And is this sort of restricting ASEAN's breakout from the region and becoming an organization of more better standing in the region? The second question is on the code of conduct, just your views on it. And should ASEAN stop looking at a code of conduct and leave it to individual nations to battle it out with China, given the standing that or the instability that is being caused, specific reference to Vietnam earlier and presently with Philippines? And what are your views on Trump's invite to Xi Jinping for his inauguration? And what would have been the impact? What is the impact on the region first? And what could have been the impact if the invite had been accepted? Last question is that should ASEAN consider changing its consensus approach? And if it did so, would it benefit the organization in a better outreach and a better standing? And I think I'll go in the same sequence we started with. So Captain Furuya, if you'd also like to add any other points which you would have liked to express, maybe 2 to 3 minutes per speaker, and so that we stop within the time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for your questions. And I'd like to take your second question, code of conduct. Well, I'm very skeptical to conclude a code of conduct because firstly, I didn't see, or I haven't seen any motivations from Chinese side to agree upon the code of conduct. This is one thing. And then the second thing is that what do you want from the adoption of code of conduct from a Chinese side as well as the ASEAN side? Well, I think the Chinese side, well, I think if this is adopted, it means that China, the requirement consists of only what China can agree to. It means that I think it is, the consolidation of the existence international law. And then what we observed in this region is that China has not fully complied with existing international law. So from that perspective, I don't think the code of conduct is something very effective one. And I think it will be remained as a symbol of, the China and ASEAN, friendly relationship, and full stop. So it means nothing, I would say, nothing more than the current document, the DOC, document of declaration of conduct. So from that perspective, well, I think it is better for ASEAN to move forward the DOC and not try to conclude COC, the code of conduct. That's my point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Koga.
Thank you very much. So for all the 4 questions are really interesting, and then I just kind of make a really snap comments like on each of them. The first one, if China as the top kind of economic partner for the Southeast Asia is a good thing or bad thing. I think whether or not it's bad or good, I think the Southeast Asian countries want that because China is a kind of source of the economic development for the regional states, so that they could actually still rely on that. And then I think this is the fact of life, I guess. So that they have to actually do something. The question is whether that kind of relation could damage its relation with the United States or other kind of the countries which have the concerns over the Chinese economic practice. I think this is something that the ASEAN needs to work on. But then I think the cutting off or the reducing the economic activity with China is not really the idea for the Southeast Asia. Code of conduct, I completely agree with the Furuya-san. And then I think this is the gesture. I think it's not the substance, it's more kind of gesture that they could actually keep the channels of communication between ASEAN and China. Something like Trump and invite C. Yes, that's interesting. I'm not really sure what's going to be different, even if she is going to accept it. But if accepted, there's gonna be the bilateral communication at the summit level, which is actually probably shape the dynamics of the U.S.-China relations too. So I think it remains to be seen. Fourth, the consensus decision making, if we could actually change it in the ASEAN's decision making system, I think that they should actually talk about it, but then they have to be also careful about this because the beauty of the consensus decision making process is that no matter how much power each country has, they could actually be equal footing in the making the decision. And then this is why the ASEAN attracted the member states and then maintain the ASEAN kind of as a unity. So they have to be really careful and under what condition they could actually change the consensus decision making. This is the important thing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Rahul.
Right. So I'll start with the first question, the State of Southeast Asia survey. My submission to you, Chair, and to rest of the House is that, and I hope our British and Canadian colleagues can also understand this. Surveys are like homeopathy medicines. You cannot have too much of it, because if you have too much of it, it is going to have side effects. So this survey, for example, the State of Southeast Asia survey has to be, it gives you a broad kind of hint as to what is happening in the region, but that's it. To my mind, you have to also read between the lines. So State of Southeast Asia survey, when it comes to China, tells us that China is an existential reality. It exists there, and it is of course, the most important country when it comes to economic well-being and prosperity of Southeast Asian countries. But are they that well-liked as Japan is? Or are they as acceptable as Canada is when it comes to conflict resolution, peace building? So that is the question that we have to ask. You are there and you are very important for the survival, economic survival of Southeast Asian countries, but that's about it. Whether you are desirable is a question that we should ask. I think on the code of conduct, I agree with Koga-san and Furuya-san that even though the pace of this negotiation has been very slow and it has been very frustrating, this gives ASEAN some agency and a face from the ASEAN point of view, that it has some agency in the region. But going bilateral in resolving the dispute with China, I think is both impractical and not desirable, because remember, all ASEAN countries, the claimant countries, have their disputes, their internal disputes. So even when you resolve your problems with China, you still have your overlapping claims. So the only way to deal with this is going multilateral. And I'll go to the fourth question straight, leaving Trump and Xi. And that is whether ASEAN should reconsider its consensus approach. I think the European style of majority qualified voting is something that ASEAN should start considering. And there are scholars who've been talking about it. Professor Amta Acharya has written quite a lot on that. So maybe ASEAN -1 or ASEAN -2, I don't know what equation, but certainly a majority qualified voting kind of system should be deliberated upon, and maybe that's a way forward for ASEAN.
Thank you so much, Rahul. Dr. Hayton?
Thank you. I think there's a sort of interesting phenomenon in Southeast Asia when it comes to commenting on the great powers. And one is that you can say whatever you like about the United States. You can be as critical as you want. You can attack them for being interventionist and isolationist. But no one ever says anything critical about China. Have you noticed that publicly? And yet privately, you know, we're all here saying, you know, whenever you meet a Southeast Asian delegation, it's, oh, we're so worried about China, their behavior, this, that, and the other. But they won't say so publicly. And so what does this tell us? Something about, you know, China's diplomacy and actually what people think about China. So in the privacy of their, you know, internet form, they can say something in the ISEAS survey or whatever it is. But we, you know, I think this speaks to a deeper concern about China, is that, you know, this fear of being intimidated and dominated and not being able to speak about it. So that, I think, is their major soft power weakness. On the code of conduct, it's not going to happen, but that doesn't mean that we should stop, you know, talking about it. It's much better to talk to each other than not to talk to each other. But the fundamental issues, you know, will be that China wants to only talk about the Spratly Islands, Vietnam wants to include the Paracels, Philippines wants to talk about Scarborough Shoal, some countries want it to be legally binding. Fundamentally, the Southeast Asian countries want the code of conduct to bind China and control its behavior, whereas China wants to use the code of conduct to control the behavior of outside powers like the US and India, so that China would have a veto over any military exercises with outside partners or oil exploration with outside companies. Should ASEAN consider going ASEAN minus? Again, it won't happen. The point of ASEAN is to prevent outside intervention in the internal affairs of ASEAN states. And anything which looks like diluting the power of individual states to have a veto is not going to fly. I think that's the end of that discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nagy.
Thanks for the great questions. These are tough ones. Maybe I'll be contrarian. I do think there's a place for ASEAN to start thinking about how to solve problems when they're fractured by outside powers. And that is the reality. And again, I think Bill mentioned this quite frankly in closed discussions. They're very critical of China. In open discussions, they're not. So is there a place for rethinking how ASEAN works? I think that this is what ASEAN countries should be thinking about. And it doesn't have to be an all for one or all, kind of process. It could be case by case. And I do think that there is a case by case approach that may look at solving problems in a sub-regional way. The ASEAN survey, as Rahul mentioned, it's a good, it tells you a little bit of something and it tells you a lot about nothing. So I think it's important for us to be, again, talking to partners at the bilateral level, at the minilateral level, and then at the ASEAN level, and try to distinguish the difference between each level so we get a better understanding of what is the region's dynamics, what is their priorities, and how can we strengthen their integratedness so they can really fulfill their strategic autonomy. And this is tough. But I think that there are opportunities to strengthen the strategic autonomy of ASEAN countries. And it may be working first with priority partners. And then as you've built credibility with the priority partners, maybe you move into some of the partners such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, which are much more difficult. On the Xi invite, fascinating topic, especially after Mr. Trump is nominated. Senator Marco Rubio, who is banned from China. There seems to be lots of contradictions in what the Trump administration is doing. And in that sense, it's continuity rather than consistency in messaging. We see the Trump administration being very inconsistent, and maybe that is part of the strategy to position itself in a stronger negotiating position with China for an eventual trade deal down the way. I agree with Furuya-san and the others on the code of conduct, and I'll stop there. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Ms. Joanne Lynn Weiling.
Yes, yeah, I'll start with the first question. And in fact, the State of Southeast Asia Survey is a flagship publication of my institute and also my center. And I'm also one of the author of that report. So I would say that on your question of why the region is choosing China over the US, and it's really the first time in many years that this has happened. And I guess that, and we will see this trend going forward, I believe. And I believe that it's also because of the decrease in US influence in the region recently, and like I said, moving forward. And that is due to many factors. First is the lack of economic engagement. We've talked about IPEF. There's no market access. Second is because of American protectionism. We saw the Inflation Reduction Act, the Chip and Science Act is only to impose tariffs of China, and it's not doing any positive. It doesn't have a positive impact on Southeast Asia. And third, I think this is a most important factor, which I see it, and that is the Israel-Hamas conflict, which has actually led to a decline in U.S. Strategic influence in the region, especially amongst the Muslim majority countries. So if you were to study the nuances of that survey, you will see that the support for China has gone up amongst the Muslim majority country, and that is Brunei, Indonesia and Malaysia, and that is actually a result of the war in Gaza. And China, I think that China is actually the region's most influential economic, political, and security power, but there are nuances to this geopolitical dynamics, as previous speakers have also mentioned. And I think what we need to know is that despite China's growing influence, the region is also very wary of China's rise. And it has indicated that they are worried about China's growing economic influence and political influence, as well as China's action in the South China Sea, its use of economic tools and tourism to punish countries' foreign policy, and of course, its interference in the country's domestic affairs. So I think these are the concerns that the region has about China that we should also recognize. And the second question about the COC, I just feel that the basic minimum, as what Satria has mentioned earlier, is really to adhere to the international law, including UNCLOS. So if that agreement is not legally binding, then there is really no need for the COC. You can just stick to the DOC, because the DOC is basically doing whatever that is not legally binding at this point. And then the last question about the consensus decision-making and ASEAN being at its lowest common denominator, I also agree with all the other previous speakers. And then we need to realize that ASEAN is not EU, and ASEAN will never be EU. And anything, to go beyond like a inter-regional cooperation and not intra-regional cooperation is likely not going to fly. Because we need to know that, I think one of the speakers has mentioned earlier, and that is a very important point, ASEAN is a heterogeneous region. And because, of the differences in governance system, in priorities, in alignments, there's no way that ASEAN is going to see eye to eye on everything. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Happy to note there is consensus on a lot of aspects in the panel itself. So that's good. Mr. Pitlo, over to you. Mr. Pitlo?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Yes, thank you. So yeah, great question. So on the first question about, the growing influence of China in Southeast Asia, I would say, of course, the economics is also very much behind it. Of course, for the last over a decade, 13 years if I'm not mistaken, since 2009. China has become the largest trade partner of ASEAN. Even the Philippines, which of course relations with China because of maritime and territorial issues in the South China Sea. China has been the country's largest trade partner since 2016. That has been consistently held despite of course the ups and downs in the relations. So I think some way one can read the survey as as a bellwether of where the ASEAN the region's priority lies, which is economics. So, but again, this is not one way. In recent years, ASEAN has also become the largest trade partner of ASEAN. Of China. So I think this is bound to grow as China encounters headwinds in US, in Europe, in Western markets. China would look more to global South, and its peripheral diplomacy will, of course, increase in importance. And of course, the market of 500 million people in ASEAN is, of course, a good opportunity to seize. Of course, in ASEAN, there are also those who view the possibility of compartmentalizing security issues so that they don't affect broader relations with China, which is always fraught when it comes to security issues because of the South China Sea or because of dam building in the upper reaches of the Mekong River. And so there are those who think that it's very important to take China for what it is, find ways to live with China, push back if necessary, but don't drop the ball in terms of cornering Chinese economic largesse. The concern about the apparent silence of ASEAN countries when it comes to publicly criticizing China, I think probably I share Joanne's view that probably it may stem from, of course, the concern about China's penchant for economic statecraft to, of course, show its displeasure about foreign policy or security policies taken by its neighbors in Southeast Asia. On COC, this ASEAN minus X formula looks very appealing, but I think it can also be a slippery slope. So, for instance, non-mainland Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, some countries like Laos may say you don't have a direct stake on the Mekong River issue, so you can excuse yourself. So I think this generates some kind of course, friction within the group about those that are directly have interest or stake on the issue will understandably have more feelings or sentiments and try to encourage the rest to rally around it. But of course, they have different views on different issues, and relations with major partners like US or China is different across the 10 members. So I think it's difficult. A way to do it would be for instance, on the South China Sea, if non-relevant members, meaning countries that do not have direct stake on the maritime issue, the maritime role, if they could excuse themselves or allow the direct claimant states, the 4 claimant states, or say the 5 coastal states of ASEAN that bear on the South China Sea, to take the lead. I think that would be the way to go. But I don't see it happening anytime soon. And besides, the COC again is not a panacea to for all the incidents in the South China Sea. A lot is putting hope, that the COC will put an end to untoward sea and air incidents in the South China Sea. But I think it's a tall order. Of course, given the complex nature of the South China Sea, certain features are only contested by 1 or 2 players. But of course, broader swaths of the sea are subject to overlapping EEZ claims, by some neighbors. On President Trump inviting President Xi, I think it's a welcome gesture. It's something that I think might be expected, and it may help set the tone for bilateral ties. Again, it's too early to say, but to the extent that it will help stabilize ties, the most important bilateral relations in the world. If that can help set it at a proper frame, given the many areas that they compete, I think it's something that should be welcomed. On ASEAN changing its consensus decision making, I think for the most part ASEAN has great success in securing consensus on economic deals, but it always have problems when it comes to dealing with security issues, and I think that will remain the case. And we already see the case of Myanmar within the neighborhood, within the community. Of course, that undermines the relevance of ASEAN in addressing a security issue in its own backyard, let alone, of course, the South China Sea, where, of course, you have a major partner with which you have disputes with. So I think this would still be the case for ASEAN. So changing the consensus for security issue.
Mr. Pitlo, thank you. I'm sorry for butting in, but I've already got a prompt. So, Mr. Alcatab, you're the last speaker. Quick 1 minute, 2 minute response, please.
Yeah, not to prolong any further, I think I just want to make my comment very quick. I will not be able to answer all the questions, but I think, speaking of survey, it reminds me when the Russia's invasions to Ukraine began, I think some years ago, when Russia is being heavily criticized for the invasions, the Indonesian public were absolutely unfazed. In fact, Putin gained more and more popularity, in Indonesia. This is also synonymous to what is happening to China, as Joanne rightly pointed out earlier. It becomes more and more popular for us in Muslim majority country to have a constructive deal with China, because people can see the damage and the benefits from cooperative arrangement with China. Because what is important for ASEAN member states in general are economic cooperations and prosperity. The others are just cherry on top. So that is why the relationship between ASEAN, China, ASEAN, and Russia becomes more and more popular, because it's a survey. It's about the views, and that views also at some point reflects the way ASEAN states formulates their engagement in extraterritorial ASEANs. And also to touch upon a bit quickly about consensus approach, I don't think it is very unlikely, because as Joanne also pointed out, that ASEAN is not an EU. ASEAN is a consensus based approach region, because the very principle of ASEAN was coming from what we mentioned here in our country as musyawarah mufakat, dialogue based governance. That's what ASEAN is. And this was also tested, I think, 5 years ago. I have a very delighted conversation with a Malaysian diplomat, where the word Rohingya coming up on the table. The Myanmar delegation was always ready, to disengage from that conversation. So that is, that is the point, that ASEAN is not going to be able to go beyond this consensual approach, because ASEAN is not going to let anyone going off the table in any matter, because consensus or dialogue base is the very embryo to ASEAN. I think I will put my explanations to this end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I think we've had a wonderful panel, and we have the next panel already waiting. And apologies to Ambassador Sajanhar. Thank you for the overtime. 8 speakers. I think this is the biggest panel, and I don't think we've done too badly in timing. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Have a nice day.